Hello, and since it's a holiday and I go to work late on a holiday when I work on holiday Mondays, um, I have a little time. I wanted to do a part two to my "Are You a Rebel or Remnant" series, where I discuss why I believe the King James Bible is the right Bible, the last authentic Bible that we should be using, and the reasons that some of the reasons that I give. But I wanted to go on and add another thing. We're going to talk today um, just briefly about the beginnings of American fundamentalism, because that's going to play an important part in the proliferation of other Bible versions too. So let's talk a little bit about the beginnings of American fundamentalism. In the late 1800s, a series of meetings of conservative Protestant Christians in America began, some of which being held at Niagara, New York, resulted in them being referred to as the Niagara Conference. The clergy and laymen that attended these meetings are referred to as the founding fathers of fundamentalism by Ernest Sandin, a scholar of American religious history, in his article for Church History toward an historical interpretation of the origins of fundamentalism from March 1967. The label fundamentalist was not coined until 1920 to describe conservative Protestants of varying denominations who were actively militant in defending the basics of what they perceived was Orthodox Christian belief, and that's from James M. Alt's book, Spirit and Flesh, Life in a Fundamental Baptist Church from 2004. The term came from a series of essays published in the first decade of the 20th century as the fundamentals, provided free to the Christian public. And that's also Sandine. I got that from him. Note where the evangelical R.A. Torrey figured prominently among the authors, and I have those books on my Kindle. They're fascinating to read. Fundamentalists rose to national prominence in their involvement in a judicial proceeding in the mid 1920s that is popularly known as the Scopes Monkey Trial over the teaching of evolution in public schools. Although it was a legal win for those opposed to evolution being taught, the resultant negative publicity drove fundamentalists further from mainstream America. It resulted in the development of fundamentalist universities such as Bob Jones University, whose faithfulness to the critical text of Westcott and Hort and the inerrancy of the unseen original autographs figured prominently in the origin of the King James only movement. And you can read that. Elijah G. Dan, Leaving Fundamentalism, Personal Stories, written in 2008. It's a book. After the 1920s, fundamentalism ceased to be a powerful political movement and retreated from engagement with the majority of the public who did not share its views. By the 1960s, virtually all fundamentalist churches, were Baptist. That's according to George Marsden in his Understanding Fundamentalism and Evangelicalism, book written in 1991. The movement rose to prominence again in the 1970s with Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority and the courting of the movement by the 1980 Ronald Reagan presidential effort. James Alt, again, Spirit and Flesh. Fundamentalism as a movement within conservative Protestant churches was ultimately made possible by the doctrines set forth early in the Reformation by Martin Luther. Luther's exchange of the authority to access and interpret biblical text from the organization of the Roman Catholic Church to the individual Christian ultimately allowed for the existence and justification of modern Protestant fundamentalism. And that was from an article. Robert Glenn Howard wrote The Double Bind of Protestant Reformation, The Birth of Fundamentalism, and the Necessity of Pluralism from the Journal of Church and State in 2005. Luther expressed a new line of thought in opposition generally accepted Christian belief that took access to biblical texts and interpretation of them from the priest or an elite consisting of the educated and gave this to the individual Christian. For Luther, every man was a theologian. And that's also from Robert Glenn Howard. Now, what's important next, we're going to discuss what is the traditional fundamentalist view of the Bible. If you regard yourself as a fundamentalist, what is the traditional fundamentalist view of the Bible? We're going to discuss that very important topic next. I hope I get to it really soon, but next time. Thank you.